Hi everyone, Hugo here, one of the co-hosts of the show. What you're about to watch is a highlight from one of our most recent episodes. To get access to the full version, receive 2 exclusive episodes a month, get every episode 1 week early, and help us stay as independent as possible, support us on Patreon through the link below. Thank you. Now enjoy the show. Upper Volta, what Burkina Faso was called at the time, just as a reminder to the listeners, gained independence from France in 1960. It inherited the very colonial economy structured de facto for underdevelopment that JT just talked about. The political setup at independence reflected this economic dependency. Maurice Yameogo, the country's first president, consolidated a one-party state under what they called the Volcanic Democratic Union. His government was staffed by members of the urban petit bourgeois, people like clerks, teachers, bureaucrats, and military officers educated under French colonial rule. This entire class of people relied heavily on French aid, leading to French personnel holding senior administrative posts, allowing French capital and even French currency systems to directly tie the new republic to Paris. In short, what existed before independence simply continued. The state was manned by a comprador elite, now independent only on paper. In non-nerd terms, domestic traders, so-called intermediaries between France proper and the voltaic peasantry, now LARPed sovereignty. This being said, though, I have to mention that while we do love our heavy wording here on the show, as the proletarian Ubermenschen that we are, this sort of class dichotomy developing in Burkina was, to a very large extent, unavoidable under the material conditions left to Burkina as a former colony. The economic base of post-colonial Upper Volta left little room for a national bourgeoisie rooted in domestic industry. They were bourgeois not by virtue of owning factories, but through their access to the state apparatus and their role as intermediaries in French capitalist extraction of our favorite word, surplus. Imagine if your middle manager was the administration of a whole country, with your company's board of trustees being the French government, a professional managerial class government, so to say. The new leader, Yameogo, quickly alienated the masses through austerity, wage cuts, removal of subsidies, and lavish personal spending. By 1965, strikes by teachers and civil servants spread, joined by unions representing urban workers. These protests represented the growing discontent of the urban petit bourgeois, whose demands were not simply economic but also political: greater participation, less corruption, and a voice in decision-making. The breaking point, though, came in January of '66, when massive demonstrations and strikes paralyzed the entire country. The army, led by a Lieutenant Colonel Lamizana, intervened, ousting Yameogo. The 1966 coup was not a revolutionary rupture, but a bourgeois military recomposition. The comprador class sought to preserve its privilege by replacing pretty much what they saw as a now discredited leader. Off with the head while the same body remained. Lamizana suspended the constitution, dissolved parliament, and ruled with the backing of both the army and France. The coup's class meaning was clear. It secured the comprador order against both popular uprisings and independent proletarian politics. For somebody who wants to maybe make an interesting parallel on the conversation of, capitalism utilizing violent means in order to preserve itself, is something that we very commonly define as fascism. Happened to a certain extent here, but under an environment and a climate that was even more unhinged. It was not even properly established capitalists using violence in order to preserve the current status quo. It was the servants of foreign capitalists that used violence to preserve the servant status quo. So fascism de facto is cuckolded, but this one is even unfortunately in post-colonial environments even more of a pathetic fascistic move. Jumping forward to the 70s, urban unions started organizing their power in hopes of participating as real political actors, with the teachers' unions being particularly actually militant. They embodied the contradictions of colonial education. They were trained to administer a modern state, but then they were trapped in a dependent economy that offered very few rewards. Their demands obviously focused on wages, job security, and the dignity of intellectual labor, but they also became vehicles for broader critiques of neocolonialism. To make it as simple as possible, the French send a particular way of educating the locals that is, for example, used also in France, where they're talking about fraternité, liberté, or whatever the fuck, and you're a teacher that really gets into this, let's call it material, and then you're teaching it to your kids, and you're like, what the fuck am I talking about? You actually, unironically, gain some sort of spontaneous, to an extent, maybe not class consciousness, but understanding of where your country is still in relation to the quote-unquote old colonial rulers, which then you realize are not that old of a colonial ruler. Students, likewise, became a radical force. Student unions across all of West Africa had historically been incubators of anti-colonial thought, and in Upper Volta they began articulating demands for democratic freedoms, anti-corruption measures, and alignment with liberation movements all across the continent. Their class base was, as to be expected, children of clerks, civil servants, and minor landowners. All of this obviously gave them the ideological tools to critique the system, but also, unfortunately, limited their ties to peasantry. See how everything, to an extent, is always comes back to class, with all due respect. To continue, workers' unions, in contrast, were numerically smaller. With little industry, the urban working class in Upper Volta was confined to railway workers, miners, construction crews, and, public sector employees. Their struggles centered on wages and conditions, but, they did not possess the numbers or weight to dominate politics as in more industrialized African states. Thus, the political dichotomy of the 1970s came from the urban petit bourgeois, teachers, students, and junior officers that we mentioned earlier, whose ideological radicalism outpaced their, what they started to feel, limited class power. In a way, they knew just how much they were missing out on because they understood the colonial oppressive dynamic. But that's not the peak of these fascinating and sometimes sad contradictions. No, those lie in Upper Volta's so-called externalized proletariat. By the 1970s, up to 2 million Burkinabe lived and worked in the Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and other neighboring states. These workers, employed in cocoa plantations and urban construction, represented the true proletarian class of Upper Volta, wage laborers exploited by both Ivorian and French capital. The money these people sent back home was very vital to Upper Volta's survival, yet their absence left the country without a domestic proletarian base capable of spearheading revolutionary politics. This is another example of how there can be, and we have had episodes discussing this, there can be a class-conscious criticism of migration, not one of xenophobia. We're like, oh, these people are different, why the fuck they're coming? But conversations about brain drain, or the conversations about the draining of an entire class of people from a particular country, which then totally removes any ability of the remaining class to ensure its own representation in political governance. Inside Upper Volta, the population remained overwhelmingly peasant, where they bore the brunt of droughts, IMF austerity, and corruption, but remained dispersed, tied to land, and difficult to mobilize on a national scale. This structural condition meant the fermentation of revolution had to come from the urban petit bourgeois, acting as a sort of surrogate proletariat, if you'll excuse my borderline vulgar definition. They pushed radical ideas in the absence of a large domestic working class. And this contradiction, my dear friends and listeners, a peasant majority at home, proletariat abroad, set the limits of said political mobilization. This is the stage that Thomas Sankara entered. Had insanely complex matrix of contradictions. A young military officer trained in Madagascar, he absorbed Marxist, anti-imperialist, and pan-Africanist ideas. Within the army, he forged ties with radical junior officers, and outside it, he cultivated relations with students and unions. His ascent to power in the August of 1983 with a coup was the culmination of alliances between radicalized petit bourgeois strata and sections of the military disillusioned with comprador stagnation. Once in power, Sankara sought to transform the neo-colonial state into an instrument of popular emancipation. His government, the National Council of the Revolution, launched ambitious programs like economic self-reliance, where they refused IMF loans, invested in agriculture, and started campaigns for food self-sufficiency. Mass mobilization, where they did literacy drives, vaccination campaigns, tree planting, and women's emancipation. Anti-comprador discipline. Officials required to disclose wealth. Luxury was banned. Bureaucrats forced into modest lifestyles. And Pan-Africanism. The denunciation of debt slavery calls for African unity, true internationalism, and solidarity with other liberation movements. Before listeners start, scratching their heads and being like, that sounds like, classic reformism to me, you would genuinely be wrong. Sankara's government was not simply a set of reforms, but a revolutionary attempt to reconfigure class relations in a semi-colonial society. His land redistribution programs, for instance, directly attacked the authority of traditional chiefs whose control over land had been for long a mechanism of both feudal and colonial domination. By empowering peasants to cultivate land collectively and by promoting women's equal rights to land, Sankara sought to dismantle both patriarchal and neo-feudal structures. These measures threatened the comprador class and local intermediaries of French capital, since their control of surplus relied on precisely those pre-existing hierarchies. Sankara's insistence that he who feeds you controls you.
De côté ces aides par notre grande production, il faut réussir à produire plus. Produire plus. Produire plus parce que il est normal que celui qui vous donne à manger vous dicte également ses volontés.
Encapsulated this drive for sovereignty, severing dependence on French imports and aid, was not only economic policy, but a class project aimed at breaking comprador mediation. He was attempting to redraw class lines, not stabilize them as a reformist would. At the same time, Sankara's reliance on mass mobilization committees and revolutionary tribunals revealed both the strength and weakness of his rule. These grassroots institutions bypassed the comprador bureaucracy and offered ordinary people, peasants, workers, women, a direct role in governance. Yet they were also fragile. Created from above by a revolutionary petit bourgeois leadership rather than consolidated through proletarian class struggle. While they energized the masses, they lacked the durability of entrenched class power. The absence of an organized industrial proletariat meant Sankara had to substitute political will for material base, sustaining the revolution through charisma, discipline, and, voluntarist campaigns. This substitution, while momentarily effective and completely understandable, because what the fuck else was he going to do, could unfortunately not withstand the counteroffensive of entrenched comprador elites, imperialist isolation, and internal dissent within the military itself. To make it very simple, in order to understand the difficult contradictions set against his revolution. I want to literally list them out one more time just so that you guys can properly process the material. So let's go. Number one, the urban petit bourgeois, once radical, resisted when their privileges were cut. The revolution quite literally went too far for their privilege. Number two, the comprador bourgeoisie and traditional chiefs opposed land reform and taxation for obvious reasons. Number three, France and Côte d'Ivoire felt directly threatened by his independence, particularly his refusal of foreign aid and criticism of neocolonialism. We know what imperial and capitalist states do to revolutions. Number three was even more than the previous ones, completely unavoidable, right? And number four, finally, crucially, the absent proletariat meant Sankara could not anchor his revolution in a mass industrial working class, instead having to rely on mobilizing peasants whose local grievances were difficult to translate into stable national power. These tensions unfortunately culminated in October of 87 when Blaise Compaoré, I don't even want to properly pronounce his stupid fucking name, Sankara's former ally, led a coup backed by external powers. Sankara was assassinated, and with him, the revolutionary project collapsed. The comprador bourgeois, in alliance with French imperialism, did guess what? Reasserted control. In the end, Sankara's overthrow revealed the enduring contradictions of Burkina Faso, a nation of peasants with its proletariat abroad, trapped in the orbit of imperialist dependency, and struggling to forge a revolutionary path under the leadership of a radicalized petit bourgeois. But more on that from Comrade Hakim. Thank you for watching. To gain access to the full episode, receive 2 exclusive episodes a month, get every episode 1 week early, and help us stay as independent as possible, support us on Patreon through the link below.